Başladık hocam.
Evet, İzmir Dilbilim Çevresi'nin 74.sü ne hoş geldiniz 74. buluşmaya. Beni özlemişsinizdir diye düşünüyorum. Uzun süredir moderasyon da yapmıyordum. Bugünkü konuğumuz Erzincan Binali Yıldırım Üniversitesi Eğitim Fakültesi İngiliz Dili Eğitim Bölümünden Doktor Bahar Aksu. Konuşmasının başlığı Regional Dialect Effects on L2 English Tense-Lax Vowel Production. Öncelikle bölümümüz adına ve İzmir Dilbilim Çevresi adına kendisine teşekkür ediyoruz. Konuşmamızı, e, konuşma davetimizi kabul ettiği için ve bizi onurlandırdığı için. Sözü daha fazla uzatmadan hocamıza bırakıyorum. Buyurunuz.
Teşekkür ederim. Ben beni konuk ettiğiniz için teşekkür ederim, davet ettiğiniz için. I'm so happy to share my PhD research with you. And if you are guys all ready, I can start with my title, Regional Dialect Effects on L2 English Production, which is what I studied for the last 6 years for my PhD. But tonight I will just talk about one aspect of it, and I will briefly mention the theoretical background and provide you my research questions and then show you the results. What did I find in terms of speech production? And we will discuss the findings with you, and hopefully I will receive or answer some questions from you. So with the theoretical background, when we learn a second language or when we try to perceive and produce second language sounds, things are slightly different than what we learn when we learn a native language or our first language. So basically everything goes through our L1 filter, native language filter. And based on the previous studies, there are a few influential speech models which conceptualize how we perceive and produce non-native speech sounds when we learn a second language. And among these three, as you can see on the screen, are the top cited or most influential ones in the field of phonetics. And the speech learning model, which was recently revised, like 2 years ago, it was revised again, and essentially discusses that our perception of new sounds or non-native sounds are dependent on their proximity to L1 sounds individually. So each sound will have different level of difficulty according to how close to L1 sound, nearest L1 sound. And based on that, it provides 3 different scenarios: identical sounds, new sounds, and similar sounds. And for the identical sounds, which is easiest to learn in a way, because it has the direct transfer from the L1. So if you have a sound, if you have the same sound in your L1, it's so easy because it's almost identical acoustically or perceptually identical in L2. If it's a new sound, it is more difficult to learn because it is different than its nearest L1 sound, but yet the learner needs to create a new category, phonological or phonetic category for this sound to differentiate it. And the similar sounds, which is the most difficult learning condition for L2 speech perception or production, is the one when 2 sounds, 2 non-native sounds, are too close to one another that the listener or the speaker are not able to create a separate category for these 2. And if we find some examples, for example, we do have the P sound, and if the second language we are learning have the P sound at similar acoustic rates, it's very much identical, so we will have no difficulty in perceiving or producing this one. When it comes to new sounds, for example, in Turkish, we do have this open A sound, like, you know, when we say candy, it's an allophone, but when we learn in English as a second language, it becomes a phoneme, so it creates some sort of difficulty for us, which means this allophone in our L1, the A sound, needs to be perceived separately and produced properly as well in order to sound intelligible, etc. And lastly, the similar sounds, for example, we do have the sheep contrast, for example. These sounds are too similar if you don't have a durational contrast in your language. So basically, you are not able to perceive the difference or produce it. Like Spanish speakers, they don't have the E sound as well, so they combine these 2 into one E sound. So this is in a very, very short wrap-up speech learning model revised version of it. Another model focuses on perception again, which is the perceptual assimilation model of second language. And it essentially argues that the perception of a non-native sound is achieved through the native language and its similarities and discrepancies based on an articulatory framework. So how we perceive those articulatory gestures and categorize those new sounds. So, but for each sound, we have a varying degree of contrast. And it, again, provides some scenarios or different perceptual mechanisms for each non-native sound. And among these, we do have two category assimilation, for example. So a non-native sound contrast, which we all know from the English, the interdental TH sounds, we assign these two as two and this separately, as in the case of the two category assimilation of perception assimilation model. So each non-native sound is assigned or assimilated to a separate category and then perceived and produced separately. And that was called two category assimilation. Then we have category goodness assimilation proposed by them as well, again, where listeners categorize the sound as a poor or good assimilation of the sound in the native language. So we do have the R sound, like the strut vowel or start vowel. And depending on our perception or the articulatory gestures, you know, we might perceive it as a R sound or more like the lot vowel or somewhere between R, O. So it depends how well we perceive the sound. So it is more like a rated degree, like how good we are able to assimilate or how bad we are able to assimilate this one. Another one is the single category assimilation. Listeners will assimilate two contrasted sounds in the L2 as a single phone in their L1. So as if you remember the E, sheep, sheep contrast from the other scenario from SLMR, it's pretty much the same, but this one focuses on the perception. So this model only provides the conceptual framework of second language speech perception, but doesn't tap into how we produce those or to what extent perception and production are related. And lastly, we do have the second language linguistic perception model provided by Escudero in 2005. This one provides a computational L2 learning mechanism. So initially, when we are learning a second language, what do? Is copying our L1 to L2. So whatever you learn in the second language at your initial stage is your L1 phonology. And from that naive stage, with the input or exposure to non-native language, you update the phonetic boundaries of each non-native or native sounds, and you adjust the categorical representation of those sounds, and eventually reach a native-like performance. Although this is debatable because SLMR also says like, it's never possible to reach a native-like performance or pronunciation. So it's an unnecessary attempt. Like SLMR, L2LP also presents three different scenarios for L2 speech perception: new scenario, similar scenario, and subset scenario. With the new scenario, an L2 contrast between two sounds is perceptually assimilated into one category, into learners L1. So if you remember the example EE, this is pretty much similar to perceptual assimilation model, single category assimilation. It's almost the same. So learners are not able to perceive the difference and instead combine these two non-native sounds into one and perceive it. But this is like the initial level. L2LP suggests that it starts like that, but with the exposure or input, they could be able to produce this new or form this new category and able to perceive and produce it properly eventually. Another scenario is the similar scenario, which is equal to PUMC two category assimilation, like the interdental TH sounds we assign or assimilated to and D ones. So they are perceptually categorized into the two different phonetic categories. And lastly, the subset scenario is we do have a single non-native sound, like in the example I provided, the schwa sound, but it's sometimes perceived as multiple sounds. So when we say the word again, sometimes we hear learners saying again, again, again. So multiple sounds, they assign it. So one non-native sound is perceived as more than one L1 category. So that's the subset scenario. And I assume, I hope this is so far so good and it makes sense, but please feel free to ask more in the Q&A session if those theories doesn't make any sense. And starting from this L2 speech production models or speech perception models, SLMR and L2LP and the PAM-L2 as well, they both emphasize the role of L1 phonological filter. But more recently, with the studies looking at individual variation and everything, they also emphasize that assuming a homogeneous L1 system may not account for the variation in L2 speech performance. So the basic question is, do we all speak the same? Do all Turkish people speak the same Turkish, that we assume that they all going to make similar categorization or perceptual or productional differences when they learn or produce a second language non-native sound? So do they all produce and perceive the non-native sounds in the same manner? And from this point, L2LP suggests that fine-grained phonetic details, like minor details in the phonological inventory across the same L1 speakers, maybe to some extent explain the variation in second language speech production or perception. So, and there are some studies looking at those fine-grained details, looking at regional dialect influence on L2 speech production. For example, Marinescu looked at the Cuban Spanish and Peninsular Spanish speakers and how they produce English vowels. And what she found is, so these speakers produce vowels differently in terms of duration across two regional dialects, but there is no difference in terms of perception, durational perception. So no difference, no regional dialect influence in perception, but dialect influence, regional dialect influence in production. On the other hand, Simon et al. Look at the Dutch speakers from two different regions and compare their Dutch production and English vowel production compared to English speakers. What he found is, so there is regional dialect difference in L1, so their production of some Dutch vowels are different. But when it comes to second language speech production and perception of English sounds, he found that those regional dialect speakers differ in the perception of non-native contrast, but not in the production. So if we go back to the, this assuming a homogeneous L1 system, so yes, not all regional dialect speakers perceive or produce the same, but we do have inconsistent results because we just have only a bunch of studies looking at regional dialect influence on L2 speech production. And from this point, I developed my research questions, extending the scope, looking at Turkish speakers from different regional dialect backgrounds. So I look at the regional dialect speakers of Turkish, namely Istanbul and Trabzon, differ in the production of high tense-lax vowel contrast in L2 English. So basically, I look at whether does regional dialect matter when it comes to produce tense-lax contrast of fleece, kit, and foot-full contrast in L2 speech. And some of you might ask already, like, why it's these two dialects. So there are a couple of reasons. Obviously, I'm from the Black Sea region, and I'm familiar with the regional dialect of that part, Trabzon. And for studies in the literature, we do have a lot of description of the Istanbul region as the standard Turkish dialect. So I have data defining the vowels or their acoustic description for this one, and I created the one for Trabzon and compared. And in addition to that, duration isn't a phonemic contrast in Turkish, although it's a phonemic contrast in English, and it creates a challenging scenario for naive L1 learners. But more importantly, duration isn't a phonemic contrast in Turkish, but we do have the long vowels, like when we say cenaze, postane, cami, we do have the vowel lengthening, which is not very much observed in the Trabzon region. So you might hear a local speaker saying cenazesi varmış, not cenazesi varmış, or postaneye gideceğim. So it's like shortened version, whereas in Istanbul region, maybe it's the influence of the, you know, the old capital, Ottoman language, the Arabic and Persian, but they retain the long vowels a lot more compared to Trabzon region. So I wanted to check whether this might have an effect in overall to speech production and perception. But before moving that, I obviously first checked their L1 speech production. So when these speakers from Trabzon, Istanbul, do they differ in terms of E and U in Turkish? And the data says actually no. If you look at this graph here, you are going to see that E, it's like very front high and at the same level for the Trabzon and Istanbul speakers, and same goes for the U vowel. So the variation, the existing variation is actually more for the low vowels like the E, A, O sounds, whereas the high vowels are almost produced the same. So from that point, we compare these speakers when they speak English, and we did, I did acoustic analysis of the vowels in English. And here's a sample for the acoustic analysis for those interested, for students. So one of the words we used for measuring E was did. So we start analyzing the vowel from here, and we check the duration, and then we look at the, you know, spectrogram to find some form and frequency values of the production. And we did this for every individual sound, okay, for every participant and every individual sound. And how many speakers did I have? I had like 14 speakers from Trabzon, another 14 from Istanbul, and then I compared their English speech to another 14 British English speakers from England. And we confined age to 18 to 13 because we know that age is a variation in terms of speech production and perception, like older speakers are slower. And more importantly, older speakers in Trabzon may not know English very well. So I needed an age group who can speak English and produce it. I used the text from the Turding, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, which is very widely used in phonetic studies. And we measured the vowels in word media position, as we know, you know, the position of the sounds like word initial, final, etc., can change the acoustic quality. So in order to have consistent results, we fix it for word media position, but because it was taken from a text, we didn't control for the co-articulatory settings. And in total, I had 336 tokens, all segmented in Pratt for the acoustic analysis, and then we normalize the data, and then we get the acoustic correlates for the spectral and temporal aspects of each sound. So, and then we run the statistics by using mixed effect modeling and likelihood ratio tests. Sorry for the typo there. Okay, so here comes the results. So I will provide the first generic results at first. So I'm not sure whether everyone is familiar with the phonetics here, so I'm going to slightly explain. So this is like how fronted your tongue can be, like the maximum, if you just move your tongue up and front it. And this is like how back and lower it could be for the high vowels. So, and we do have the red one, the red dot shows the Istanbul speakers. The other one, the green one, shows the English speakers. How do they produce this contrast? And then we do have the Trabzon speakers. And as you might notice, very firstly, we all different from English speakers in a way for both sounds. But I'm going to get into detail with the next slide. So we're first going to look at the F1 formant value, which gives us a clue of how high a vowel is. And if you look at the kit and fleece contrast here first, what we see is the SSB speakers produce a clear contrast in terms of heightness for these two, for this pair. So E vowel is higher than the E vowel, which is similar to Istanbul speakers, or Istanbul speakers show a similar pattern like SSB speakers. But when it comes to Trabzon speakers, they don't act like them. Instead, for them, it's E, the long E, fleece vowel is very much higher compared to ship vowel. And if we look at the food goose in terms of F1, again, SSB speakers set a clear contrast here between the two vowels, whereas this contrast is like very much diminished and almost look alike for Istanbul and Trabzon speakers. So for the kit and fleece vowel, we can say that there seems to be a regional dialect variation, and Istanbul speakers have the advantage, or at least produce it more like an SSB speaker. Whereas for foot and goose vowel contrast, we see that English speakers produce it very different, and then Turkish speakers have a similar pattern where U is front, U is higher than the U vowel, unlike English speakers. So regional dialect have influence for this one exists, but not for this one, but we still have a Turkish influence, L1 influence. And next one, if we look at the F2, which gives us a clue like how fronted a vowel is, again, we see that SSB speakers produce a clear contrast in terms of front backness of these two vowels. And as we can see, Istanbul speakers follow the same pattern, although the degree is smaller, they do it. Not as good as SSB English speakers, but they still do it. Whereas for Trabzon speakers, there is no difference between these two vowels in terms of frontness. So regional dialect speakers act differently or produce these vowel differently. When it comes to foot and goose vowel, we see quite a large variation for English speakers, which arises from U fronting and ongoing sound change in English. So depending on the following consonant, it's either very much fronted or a back sound. So that explains this variation here, but still in terms of statistics, it's two different sounds in terms of frontness. And again, the pattern is slightly similar for Istanbul speakers. So for them as well, the foot vowel is fronted and the other one, the full vowel is back. But for Trabzon speakers, there is not much difference in terms of F2 or frontness. So they do a bit of difference for the F1, the height, but nothing for the F2, for both non-native sounds. And lastly, we'll look at the duration of these contrasts. So if you look at the sheep contrast here, we all see that all speakers, regardless of the regional background or L1, whatever it is, E is shorter and E sound is longer, and there is a clear contrast. Whereas for the foot and goose vowel, we see that it's not that much clear in terms of duration. So for native speakers, SSB speakers, as you can see in the green, they put a contrast in terms of duration. But for Istanbul speakers, there is a bit of contrast, but it's not that clear. It's not long enough. And more interestingly, our foot vowel, the Turkish people's foot vowel, is way longer than an English person's production of the U sound. So what we do basically here is we all produce them at the same length. So we couldn't produce a productional contrast for the foot full sound, whereas native speakers are able to do that. But we somehow do this for the sheep contrast. And overall, what does this tell us? So it says that the regional dialect speakers of Turkish produce the sheep contrast differently in L2 English, despite the fact that there is no regional dialect difference in the kit vowel, the E vowel, in the L1. So if you remember at the very back, when we examined the Turkish data, there were no difference, no acoustic difference. It was produced the same. But when this sound is paired with an non-native contrast in L2 English, we found that regional dialect speakers produce it differently. And another findings of this study is that L1 Turkish speakers are able to produce tense-lax contrast temporarily. So they are able to do the durational contrast for the kit sheep sound or kit fleece sound, but the spectral features show intricate patterns. So it's only the Istanbul speakers who are able to do F1, F2 differences, but not Trabzon speakers. And when it comes to foot full contrast, we found that the regional dialect doesn't play a role in line with L1 similarities. So this time, okay, there was no difference in the regional dialect in Turkish of the U. And when it's paired with another sound, there is still no regional dialect influence. But we see that we found that L1 Turkish speakers produce both of them as longer vowels. And we consider that there might be two reasons for that. One might be the orthographical influences, because the keywords we measured, when they included the sheep or the fleece sound, it has two graphemes. Like in the word sheep, you know, it's like double E. So maybe the learners perceive it as a longer sound and produce it long because of the orthographical influence. Whereas for UU contrast, fruitful contrast, it was, as you can see, it was food versus full. So it was always the double grapheme, which might lead them to produce it as long as possible and never thought like it could be a short vowel as well. And another reason could arise from the functional load differences. So Lewis argues that the fleece kid contrast or the sheep contrast has a higher functional load in English. So there are a lot of frequent word contrast in English with the sheep contrast compared to fruitful contrast. So maybe the learners are not exposed to that contrast a lot, so they don't develop that spectral or temporal changes as fast as the kid fleece contrast. But obviously we need more data and we need to control the orthographical influence to say that these are the reasons, exact reasons. So far it's just speculations, unfortunately, due to the limited amount of data. So overall, an important finding of this study is that regional dialects not only matter when there is a dialect-based L1 difference. So maybe there is no L1 difference, but it may yet still lead to the differences in L2 speech production. And by this, we assume that maybe it's not like one-to-one acoustic categorical adjustment of each non-native sound, but maybe with each non-native sound or exposure to second language, the learner just readjust the phonetic categories of the whole sound inventory in the shared phonetic space of the L1 and L2. So a change in one sound might end up with a change in the whole vowel system or sound system in the inventory. And our supporting argument comes from the fact that, you know, there was no difference in the E and U vowel in Turkish, but their spectral and temporal correlates were found to be different in L2 English when they are paired with a non-native contrast. So that is me, again, being very, very quick, and I hope it was clear. And thank you so much for listening. And I'm happy to answer more questions. I guess I could be the fastest presenter ever. So sorry.
Vallahi zamanı çok güzel kullandın hocam. O yüzden sıkıntı yok. Teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi soru sormak isteyenler paneldeki kaldırma butonunu kullanarak sorularını sorabilirler. Ya da doğrudan mikrofonu açıp da sorabilirler. Şeyi de açayım. Kullanıcıların olduğu sekmeyi.
Türkçe de soru sorabilirler.
Tabii yani bu şeyde soru cevap sekmesinde zaten seansında bir şeyimiz yok, sınırımız yok. Panelden bir soru var. Ben onu bir okuyayım isterseniz. Was the duration only factor in your research? I would have the answer for that cause. Dominant factor in articulating a sound is duration. Would there be any other factors that should be taken into consideration? Maybe I missed some other things because I'm just a student in ETI.
ETI is English.
Translation and interpreting.
Okay, all right. Okay, so İlhan Bolat. Teşekkür ederim sorunuz için. Şöyle, duration'a bakmadım. Aynı zamanda slaytlarda şöyle geri gidersem, duration temporal aspect, yani şuradan şuraya kadar geçen süreyi incelemenin yanı sıra aynı zamanda şurada gördüğümüz siyah çizgiler de ve ondaki değişiklikler de bize bilgi veriyor. Sesin ne kadar önde veya yukarıda üretildiğine dair. Graflarda hatırlarsan ya da şu grafta gösterdiğim gibi mesela i sesi, uzun i'ler bayağı bir önde ve yukarıda üretilmiş, diğer kısa i sesine göre şeklinde. Bu faktörlere de baktım ama etkileyen şeyler nelerdir dediğinde sadece yerel aksan, hani ait olduğun bölge, konum, konuşmayı ne kadar etkiliyor ikinci dilde, buna baktım. Biraz daha verimiz olsaydı belki işte ardışık gelen sessiz veya önde gelen sessiz harfler, sesler ne kadar etkiliyor? Ötümlülük, ötümsüzlük arasında bir fark var mı? Ya da ben kelimeleri bir teksten aldım. Hani kelimeler gözükmeseydi de casual spoken speech'e baksaydım farklılık olur muydu gibi faktörlere de bakılabilirdi. Fakat benim veri setimde bu faktörler olmadığı için inceleyemedim. Umarım bu yardımcı olmuştur soruna.
Evet, bizim doktor öğrencimiz Esra'nın bir sorusu var.
Tabii.
Merhaba, öncelikle sesim geliyor mu onu sorayım.
Diyor.
Evet.
Tamam. Sunum için teşekkürler. Güzel bir sunumdu. Emeğinize sağlık. Ben şeyi merak ediyorum sadece. Şimdi katılımcıları seçerken ana dilin Türkçe, ikinci yabancı dilde İngilizce olan katılımcılar var. Acaba onlar İngilizce dışında başka bir dile maruz kaldılar mı? Bunu bir değişken olarak aldınız mı? Çünkü ünlülerin üretilmesi esnasında bu da o ünlünün üretilmesine bir farklılık oluşturabilir. Hani belki İngilizce dışında İspanyolca gibi, İtalyanca gibi ya da başka bir dile maruz kaldıysa orada bir farklılık olabilir. Bunu göz önüne aldınız mı? Onu merak ettim. Teşekkürler.
Ben teşekkür ederim. Çok güzel bir soru. Aldım. Kayıtlara başlamadan önce Language Background Questionnaire yapıyoruz. Hem ne kadar bölgesel aksanı kullanıyorlar veya kullanıyorlar mı? Kendilerini bölgesel aksanla tanımlıyorlar mı? Bu gibi bilgileri topladık. Aynı zamanda yabancı dil seviyeleri, tabii ki sınavlar hepsinde yoktu genç oldukları için, ama yabancı dille alakaları, kullanımları ve bildikleri başka yabancı diller, veriler var mı diye topladık. Mesela Trabzon verimizden bir katılımcımızın ana dillerinden biri de Rumcaydı.
Hı hı.
Onları dikkate almaya çalıştık. Fakat Rumca'da 5 tane sesli harf var. 5'i de Türkçe'de de dahil. Belki akustik kısmen farklılıkları olabilir ama yabancı ses olmadığı için çalışmaya dahil ettik. Fakat sınırlandırmalarımız vardı. Hepsinin araştırma bölgesinde doğmuş büyümüş 0-14 yaş aralığını orada tamamlamış olmasına dikkat ettik. Bu İstanbullu konuşmacılar için de geçerli. Çünkü bölgesel aksanlı dediğimiz zaman orada doğmuş büyümüş ve oranın konuşmasına maruz kalmış ve o şekilde ses envanterini geliştirmiş olmasını beklediğimiz için elimizden geldiği kadar kontrol etmeye çalıştık. Bir de yani genellikle ikinci dilde zaten İngilizce olarak öğreniyorlardı. Herhangi bir üçüncü dil verisi açıkçası anket sonuçlarında rastlamadım.
Tamamdır. Teşekkürler. Kolay gelsin.
Ben teşekkür ederim.
Evet. Herhalde başka soru var mı?
Evet hocam.
Chat'te var sanırım devamı İlhan Bulat'tan. Then I'm going forward. All the factors included in your research were the ones used in other studies. I mean, the studies you mentioned in your study had the same factors, or did the research limitations leverage you? Further factors that could be taken into considerations? Question mark.
Okay, thank you so much again. Well, in other studies, I think they are slightly different, and more importantly, the L1 language is different. So if you compare Dutch vowels to English vowels, they are pretty much the same, isn't it? They are very vowel-rich languages and almost like cousin languages. So it's different than comparing typologically different Turkish language to learning English vowels. So it seems similar, but in the context, it's totally different. So it cannot be exactly the same. And my research limitations come from the fact that this was originally a pilot data, so we only collected a bunch of data based on a written text. And yeah, so further factors, the role of orthography and the functional load of that kid fleece contrast versus fruitful contrast, because it's different in the language. And the other studies also mentioned that learners are better at learning the kid fleece contrast compared to fruitful. This could be measured as well. And I think I was going to say one more, but I can't. What was that? No, I can't remember. Sorry. I need to write it down maybe like next time. But yeah. Hope this helps.
Peki. Devamı gelmiş. So I got the answer like
yeah, you might do that. You might compare like our perception of Korean sounds and whether regional dialect influences it or not. But it doesn't have to come from a similar language. You can, because in real life, obviously we don't have the privilege of, you know, learning a second language which is similar to our language family. So it just provides a different context for the theoretical contribution. So if you remember the models like speech learning model or the L2LP, they have the models, but most of those studies are based on L2 English speech. So maybe we need more data from other L2, like L2, Portuguese as an L2, or like Chinese as an L2, then Turkish as an L2, to extend the scope of it. Then we can decide whether this conceptual framework is valid for all, or it actually has some bias deep down for English, if that helps.
Evet, teşekkürler sunmuş.
My pleasure.
Katılımcımız. Başka sorumuz var mı? Evet, başka soru şu an panelden yok gibi görünüyor. Kaldıran ya da sıra almak istedim.
Sanırım
Bahar Hocam
efendim.
size sormuyorsa o zaman
Tabii
ben
ki.
teşekkür edeyim güzel sunumunuz için. Bu çalışmayı genişletmeyi planlıyor musunuz? Hangi alanları, hangi region'ları dahil edeceksiniz devamında? Onu sorayım.
Good question. Bence ya Trabzon region'ı biraz daha açmak gerekiyor. Çünkü Rize ya da Karadeniz region'ı biraz daha geniş. Belki de bir veri tabanı oluşturmak gerekiyor. Çünkü farklı sesler için farklı varyasyonlar var. Rize'ye gidersek R sesiyle ve British R sesiyle benzerliği avantaj mı dezavantaj mı, standart Türkçe konuşmacılarına göre neler sağlıyor bakılabilir. Doğu bölgesi bilingualizm işin içine gireceği için çift aksanlılıktan farklı bir şey olacak. Kontekst farklı olacağı için o biraz multilingual case'e girecek. Belki Ege bölgesinden de yine bilmiyorum İzmir'in aksanı nasıl, biliyoruz vocabulary olarak farklı olduklarını. Her şeye farklı bir kelime var İzmir'de ama telaffuz olarak ne gibi farklılıklar var bilmiyorum. Açıkçası öğrenmek de isterim. Biraz da ben de yeni keşfediyorum bölgesel aksanları, ne var ne yok diye. Fakat ilginç olan şu ki çalışmada da bulduğumuz gibi bazen bölgesel aksan farklılığı yok diyoruz ama ikinci dili üretirken somehow it's there regionally. O yüzden olmaması bakmayacağımız anlamına gelmemeli. Bence her bölgeden devam edilebilir. Galiba burada en önemli sorun bölgesel aksan konuşmacılarını nasıl sınırlandıracağız? Çünkü hepimiz özellikle eğitimliyse aynı zamanda standart Türkçe konuşmacısıyız. To what extent we are regional dialect speaker or how are we going to define those speakers? Çünkü bende de aynı veri toplarken sıkıntı oldu. Gayet şiveli katılımcılar, hayır ben işte normal Türkçe konuşuyorum, ben standart Türkçe konuşmacısıyım diye self-identify ettiği zaman işin rengi biraz daha değişiyor.
Belki spoken data toplayıp onda da record'u uzun tutup natural position alındığı kısmı dahil etmek gibi.
Evet ya spoken speech ya da casual speech'in öyle güzel bir yanı var. İstediğimiz kadar alabiliriz ama onda da şöyle bir sıkıntı oluyor. Esra'nın ses kaydında iyi sesine 10-15 kez rastlayabilmişim. Çok güzel ama Bahar'ın ses kaydında 2-3 tane var. Comparability'si sıkıntı yarattığı için ve elimizde de aslında çok fazla geçmişten, literatürden kaynak olmadığı için biraz daha kontrollü gitmek zorunda kaldık. Belki bundan sonra bir sonraki adım evet biraz daha spontaneous speech üzerine bakıp hani kontrollü speech'te böyle ama spontaneous speech'te şöyle farklılıklar olabilir diye düşünüyorum. Çünkü yazı, text kullanmanın da epey etkisi olduğunu düşünüyorum. Özellikle regional dialect speaker konuşmacılar autocorrect yapıyorlar o aksanı saklamak için.
Bir teşekkür ederim. Chatbox'a bakın hocam.
Local ones, to reach them is a huge challenge. It is a challenge, and I experienced that challenge, unfortunately, and it's still quite challenging. So maybe we need some solidarity and more people interested in phonetics so we can collaborate together and extend the scope because it is necessary. So anyone is interested, feel free to email me or hit me up with further questions later. I'm happy to help all the time for the phonetics.
Teşekkür ederiz.
Ben teşekkür ederim.
Pekala. Başka soru bakıyorum. Şöyle bir chat box'a ve katılımcılara yok gibi. Ee,
Ekran paylaşımını durdurayım mı bu arada?
Valla nasıl istersen hocam. İster kalsın, ister durdur, ister devam et. Zaten olaysızca dağılacağız şu an herhalde. Öyle görünüyor.
Soru yoksa durdurayım öyleyse.
Evet. Teşekkür ederiz tekrar.
Ben teşekkür ederim.
Kabul ettiğiniz için. Hoş geldiniz. Güle güle diyelim o zaman.
Teşekkürler. İzmir'e selamlar. Aynı şekilde Erzincan'ı da bekleriz belki başka açılardan. Biz de faydalanmak isteriz uzmanlıklarınızdan.
Bir jüri, bir şey olmadığı sürece Erzincan'a
We are offended. Me and my students are offended right now.
yok, hiç görmedim daha önce tabii. Doğuda en gittiğim yer Güneydoğu'da Antep. Yani onun dışında işte Maraş'a gitmiştim çok yıllar önce.
Hı
E,
hı.
O tarafları merak ediyorum. Özellikle işte Erzurum'da bir arkadaşım var. Kars'ta bir arkadaşım var. Van'da bir arkadaşım var. Onların hepsini bir ara şöyle tek seferde bir ziyaretle aradan çıkarmak istiyorum ama
Bekleriz. Gelmişken biz de sizi konuşmacı olarak alırız arada bir.
konuşmacı olmamıza gerek yok. O tarafa gelirsem zaten her türlü ziyaret ederim yani. Orada bir bahar var diye.
Bekliyoruz.
Eyvallah.
Chatbox'a şöyle bir göz atın hocam kapatmadan. Bolca da teşekkür var.
Evet, herkese ben çok teşekkür ederim. Katıldıkları için, vakitlerini ayırdıkları için.
Ee,
Umarım faydası olmuştur.
evet, ben buradan 6 Aralık Çarşamba günü yapılacak olan konuşmanın da reklamını yapayım. Tabii sevgili Bahar, bu tür konuşmalara davet edilmenin bir kostu da şu, öğrencilerini bundan sonra zorunlu olarak buraya getiriyorsun. İDC çevresini böyle saadet zinciri gibi genişletiyoruz şeyde, Türkiye çapında. Dilbilim buluşmalarının 75.sini Doçent Doktor Turgay Sebzecioğlu, Mersin Üniversitesi Yeni Türk Dili Anabilim Dalı'ndan Doçent Doktor Turgay Sebzecioğlu ile yapacağız. Konuşmasının başlığı da evrensel dil bilgisi modelinde kurallar mı, kısıtlamalar mı olacak. Yine önümüzdeki hafta aynı saatte görüşmek dileğiyle diyorum. Kendinize iyi bakın. Bütün katılımcılara iyi akşamlar diliyorum. Görüşmek üzere.
Herkese teşekkürler. İyi akşamlar.